The morning Silas Marsh was buried, the sky over Millhaven County held the particular gray of old pewter, the kind that promised rain but never delivered it, just hung there above the hills like something unresolved. Everett Marsh stood at the graveside in a jacket he hadn't worn since his son's college graduation 7 years prior, and he kept his hands clasped in front of him, the way men of his generation had been taught to hold grief quietly with both fists. So nobody had to witness the work of it. He was 52 years old. He had spent 30 of those years calculating load-bearing tolerances for bridges and overpasses across 4 states, and he understood with the precision his profession demanded exactly how much weight a structure could carry before it failed. He was less certain about people. The pastor spoke the familiar words. The small crowd held umbrellas they didn't need. Delia, his younger sister by 6 years, stood close enough that her shoulder pressed against his arm, and he was grateful for that without knowing how to say so. She had driven up from Knoxville the night before arriving at the old farmhouse with a casserole dish and a bottle of bourbon, and they had sat at the kitchen table until past midnight, talking about everything except what they were both thinking, which was that the last person who had truly known them was now gone. Silas Marsh had been 81 years old. He had built furniture in a shed behind the farmhouse for 60 of those years, rising before dawn to work the wood before the Tennessee heat made the shed unbearable, and the sound of his handplane moving across a board had been the background noise of Everett's entire childhood. Not loud, steady, like a creek running. The kind of sound you only notice when it stops. After the service, after the neighbors had offered their condolences, in their covered dishes, in their careful handshakes after the last car had pulled down the gravel drive, and the gray sky had begun to darken toward evening, Everett walked alone to the shed. He didn't plan to. His feet simply carried him there, the way they had carried him 1,000 times before, following the groove worn into the grass between the back porch and the shed door. He pushed the door open. The hinges were the same hinges. The smell was the same smell, linseed oil sawdust, the faint mineral sharpness of iron tools. The hand planes hung on their wooden pegs in descending order of size, exactly as they had always hung. The chisels stood upright in their leather roll on the workbench blades, wrapped edges protected, as if Silas had simply stepped away for an hour. On the bench sat an unfinished side table, one leg shaped 3 still squared. Silas had been working on it the week before he went to the hospital. Everett stood for a long time looking at that table. He didn't touch anything. He just stood there in the failing light until Delia appeared in the doorway behind him, holding 2 mugs of coffee she'd made from whatever she'd found in the kitchen. She held one out. He took it without turning around. "He left you everything," she said. Not as a question. The land, the house, the shed. Everett wrapped both hands around the mug. 85 acres of mostly rocks and trouble. Delia leaned against the doorframe. He knew what he was doing. Silas always knew what he was doing. Everett finally turned. That was never the question. The question, the one neither of them named that evening, was what Everett Marsh, a retired civil engineer with a precise mind and no particular feeling for wood, was supposed to do with all of it. He stayed. That was the first decision made without ceremony or announcement. He had an apartment in Chattanooga, a reasonable lease furniture he'd bought from a catalog, a life organized around efficiency. He called his landlord and gave notice. He loaded his car with the things that mattered, his drafting tools, his books, 3 boxes of files he told himself he might need, and he drove to Millhaven County and moved into the farmhouse where Silas had lived for 50 years. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he'd figure out what to do with the property and then move on. Men of his generation made plans. Plans provided the comfortable illusion of forward motion. He had been there 2 weeks when Clem Rutherford knocked on the front door. Clem managed Millhaven Lumber Mill, which sat on 40 acres bordering the northeast edge of Everett's property, separated by a rusted wire fence that had been there longer than either man could remember. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-60s with the particular quality of stillness that comes from spending decades around loud machinery, the ability to go completely motionless between sentences as if conserving energy for the next necessary movement. He removed his cap when Everett opened the door. He looked at the cap in his hands. He looked at the porch boards. He looked finally at Everett. "Got a question for you." Clem's voice carried the flattened vowels of a man born within 20 miles of where he stood. "About the back corner of your north pasture." Everett leaned against the doorframe. "What about it?" Clem worked the cap brim in his fingers. "We've got a disposal problem. White oak offcuts mostly. Short pieces, live edge slabs, some twisted stock. Too irregular for dimensional, not worth burning good hardwood. He paused. We're paying to haul it to the county landfill, 3-4 runs a week. Everett looked past him toward the north fence line, invisible from the porch, but present in his mind the way a surveyed property always is, as a series of coordinates clear and absolute. The north corner was rocky ground with poor drainage, a low spot that held water in spring and cracked in summer. He'd walked it twice since arriving, calculating what it might take to make it usable. The answer was more than it was worth. You want to dump it there, Everett said. Clem met his eyes. Save us hauling fees. Save you doing anything with ground that won't grow much anyway. A civil engineer evaluates proposals in terms of cost benefit and structural integrity. Everett ran the numbers in approximately 4 seconds. The benefit to him was zero, slightly negative. He'd have piles of wood debris on his land. The benefit to Clem was clear. The cost to Everett was essentially nothing beyond the aesthetic inconvenience of looking at scrap timber. The rocky north corner wasn't producing anything. Wasn't going to. How much are we talking? Everett asked. Clem almost smiled. More than you'd believe. What kind of wood? White oak, mostly. Some red oak now and then. Good grain on most of it, just not commercial cuts. Everett was quiet for a moment. Not because he was considering saying no. He was considering why a man in his position would say yes. The reason arrived the way structural solutions often did, not dramatically, but with the quiet inevitability of the right answer asserting itself. He had 85 acres going nowhere. A retired engineer needs problems to solve. There was something in the phrase good grain on most of it that snagged in his memory, though he couldn't yet name what it caught on. Fine, he said. Thursday's work. Clem put his cap back on. Thursday's work. Neither of them shook hands. It wasn't that kind of agreement. It was the kind two practical men make when they both understand that a thing makes sense, and saying more about it would only introduce unnecessary variables. The first truck came the following Thursday at 7:30 in the morning. Everett watched from the kitchen window, mug in hand, as it backed through the gate in the north fence and raised its dump bed. The wood came down in a sliding rush, rough-cut slabs, short lengths, pieces with bark still attached along one edge, twisted stock that had warped during drying, wide boards, too beautiful to burn, but too irregular for any standard application. The driver lowered the bed, pulled forward, and was gone in under 10 minutes. Everett finished his coffee, washed the mug, put on his boots. He walked out to the pile the way he'd walk out to inspect a pour on a job site, methodically, without hurry, reading what was in front of him. He crouched beside a wide slab of white oak, maybe 4 feet long, 18 inches across one edge, following the natural curve of the tree's outer ring. The surface was rough from the mill saw. Bark clung to the live edge in strips. The wood itself was pale cream shading toward gold, and where the saw had caught the grain at an angle. The figure swirled in patterns that had nothing to do with any straight line ever drawn by human intention. He picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. He turned it over in his hands the way an engineer examines an unexpected load condition, with attention, without assumption. Then he set it back on the pile, stood up, brushed the bark dust from his palms, and walked back to the house. He did not go to the shed. Not that day. Not for 3 months. What he did instead was what a methodical man does when confronted with a new environment. He inventoried it. He spent the first month walking every acre of the property with a legal pad, making notes. The second month, he repaired the barn roof, replaced 3 sections of fence, cleared a drainage ditch that had been blocked since before Silas got sick. The third month, he organized the house, cataloging what was there, deciding what to keep. It was in October, sorting through the bedroom closet, that he found the notebooks. There were 14 of them. Composition books, the black and white marbled kind, filled from cover to cover in Silas's handwriting, small, slanted, utterly legible, the penmanship of a generation that had been taught to write as if the words might need to last. Some documented furniture designs, dimensioned drawings with notes about proportions and joinery. Others described wood movement and what to do about it. Drying times, finishing oils, and when to use each one. The properties of different species. Techniques for hand-cutting dovetails. The physics of a mortise and tenon joint, explained with the patience of a man who had failed at it many times before getting it right. One sentence appeared in 3 separate notebooks, written at different points in slightly different ink. The first time as a heading, the second time circled, the third time underlined twice. Straight boards build houses. Interesting boards build heirlooms. Everett read all 14 notebooks over the course of 2 weeks, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner with a glass of water and the reading glasses he'd only recently admitted he needed. He read them the way he read engineering specifications carefully, with the understanding that every detail was there for a reason, that the person who wrote it had learned each thing at some cost, that skimming was a form of disrespect toward that cost. By the end of the second week, he had read every word. He had also, without quite deciding, begun to understand something about what he was sitting on. The piles grew through November, 2 trucks on some Thursdays. The north corner disappeared under stacks of rough white oak. Neighbors driving the county road slowed down to look. Some stopped entirely, rolling down windows, craning to see what Everett Marsh was accumulating back there, and the conclusions they reached were the conclusions available to them. Firewood debris, the eccentric hobby of a man with too much land and not enough to occupy his retirement. The talk at Dottie's Diner on Saturday mornings was the kind of comfortable, affectionate ridicule that small communities reserve for people they've decided they've figured out. Dottie's sat on the main street of Millhaven, a low brick building with red vinyl stools at the counter and 4 booths along the window wall, and it served as the county's primary clearinghouse for local intelligence. Birch Calloway held court at the counter most Saturday mornings, a barrel-chested man in his late 50s who farmed 300 acres south of town, and whose opinions arrived fully formed and loudly stated with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything in Millhaven County, and therefore assumed the pattern would continue. There he is. Birch nodded toward the window one Saturday in early December as Everett's truck passed on the road bed, loaded with something obscured under a tarp. The junk man. Pete Larson, perched on the stool beside him, looked up from his eggs. Still collecting those mill scraps. Birch poured more coffee from the carafe Dottie left within reach. Must have half a mountain of it by now. You've been past his place lately. Pete shook his head. Piled up past the fence line, good 40 feet of it. Norma Fitch, 2 stools down, didn't look up from her crossword. Let the man be Birch. Not saying anything mean about it. Birch spread his hands in the gesture of a man presenting evidence. Just observing. Man spends 30 years building bridges, comes home, starts collecting scrap lumber. There's something to observe there. The laughter that moved around the diner was the soft kind, unconcerned, not cruel. The town had known Silas Marsh for decades, and by extension, had a proprietary interest in what became of his property. They weren't hostile toward Everett. They simply believed they understood the situation, and understanding is comfortable, and comfort tends to resist revision. What none of them knew, what Everett himself had not yet told anyone, including Delia, was that he had gone to the shed. He had gone on a Tuesday in late November, a cold, clear morning, when the light came in low and sharp through the single east-facing window. He had taken one of Silas's composition books with him, the one with the most detailed notes on joinery, and he had set it open on the workbench. Then he had stood there for 20 minutes doing nothing except looking at the tools and reading the layout of the space, the way he used to stand on a job site before the first pour, getting the geometry of the thing into his body before committing to action. He selected a piece of white oak from the stack Silas had kept inside seasoned stock, 3 feet long and 8 inches wide, already surfaced on one face. He found a marking gauge. He found a tri-square. He marked a line. He picked up a chisel and found the mallet hanging on its peg. He positioned the chisel at his line. He struck it once. The wood split wrong. Not catastrophically, just wrong. The grain deflected the blade in a direction he hadn't anticipated, and the cut drifted 3/16 of an inch off his mark. He examined the result for a moment, set down the mallet, went back to the notebook. It took him 4 more attempts before the chisel went where he intended. By then, 2 hours had passed, and his back ached from the unfamiliar stance, and his hands felt clumsy in the way that any new physical skill makes the hands feel as if they belong to someone only approximately similar to yourself. But the last cut had been clean. The wood had done what wood is supposed to do when the tool is presented correctly, and there was a satisfaction in that modest, specific that Everett recognized from the first time he'd correctly calculated a tension load. Not pride, just the satisfaction of a thing working as it should. He went back the next morning. By December, he was spending 4 hours in the shed every day, working through the joinery exercises Silas had documented, failing at most of them the first time, understanding why he'd failed, adjusting, trying again. He was not, by any reasonable assessment, a natural woodworker. But he was a man who had spent 3 decades solving engineering problems, which is to say he was a man who understood that failure is not the opposite of progress. It is the primary mechanism of progress, provided you're paying attention to what the failure is telling you. The first table took 11 days and looked terrible. One leg was shorter than the others by a quarter inch. The tabletop had a slight bow he hadn't caught before gluing up. The dovetail joints at the corners had gaps. He stood it in the corner of the shed and looked at it for a long time, then looked at Silas's notebooks, then looked back at the table. He identified 7 specific errors. He wrote them down. He started the second table. The second table took 9 days and looked less terrible. The third was marginally better than the second. He was not counting successes. He was counting iterations the way an engineer counts test cycles, understanding that the data lives in the accumulation. It was the 15th table built in February from a wide slab he'd pulled off the Thursday pile that changed something. He couldn't have said exactly what changed or precisely when it happened. He'd been planing the surface a long stroke, pulling the hand plane toward him, and the shaving curled up thin as onion skin, and beneath it the grain revealed itself in a way that stopped the plane mid-stroke. Not because anything had gone wrong, because what was there was genuinely, unexpectedly beautiful. The figure in the wood swirled and rippled in a pattern formed over 80 years of growth, rings responding to drought years and wet years, and the specific angle of light that had fallen on that particular hillside where that particular tree had stood. It was not a pattern anyone had designed. It was a record, a document written in wood fiber patient and complete of 80 years of surviving. Everett set the plane down. He put both hands flat on the surface and felt the temperature of the wood, the slight give of the grain under his palms. He thought of Silas holding a slab up to the light. He thought of the words Silas had used in that memory Everett had carried for 36 years without quite knowing he was carrying it furniture. Not firewood, not scrap, not waste. The table hiding inside the tree. He hadn't known what that meant at 16. He understood it now with the full precision of a man who had spent 2 months learning it through his hands. He finished the table in 3 more days. The joinery was competent rather than excellent, but the surface was honest in a way that manufactured furniture isn't honest. It required the actual material to assert itself rather than be concealed under veneer or paint. The live edge he'd preserved along one side followed the exact curve of the tree's outer ring, and it made the table feel less like something made in a shop than something discovered, as if someone had simply revealed what had always been there. He put it in the house. Delia saw it when she drove up for Christmas. She walked past it twice before she stopped. She looked at it for a long time, studying the surface with the careful attention of someone who doesn't yet have the vocabulary for what she's seeing, but knows it requires more than a glance. Then she looked at her brother. "You built this," she said. Not a question. 15th attempt. She ran her palm along the live edge feeling where the bark had been feeling, the transition from the work surface to the natural boundary of the tree. From the pile, Thursday delivery, November. Delia was quiet for a moment. Her hand didn't move from the wood. Then Everett, "This is something." He poured 2 glasses of water and set one on the table in front of her, and they stood there in the kitchen with the winter light coming in flat through the window and the table between them, and he said nothing because there wasn't anything to say yet. It was still too early to know what it meant. He was still on iteration 15. January came cold and dry. The Thursday trucks kept arriving. The piles behind the north fence grew into something that, from the county road, looked genuinely alarming. Stacked slabs 8 feet high in some places, organized by Everett, into rough rows by thickness, with spacers between layers for airflow, because the notebooks had been precise about drying time, and he saw no reason to ignore that precision. He spent mornings in the shed. He spent afternoons moving and sorting wood. He spent evenings reading. The composition books were annotated now in his own hand, in the margins. Questions answered and new questions generated a dialogue across time with a man who could no longer participate in it, but whose accumulated knowledge was proving page by page more comprehensive than Everett had initially understood. The piles kept attracting commentary at Dottie's. "How much firewood does one man need?" Birch asked one Saturday in February, addressing the diner at large. "I'm genuinely asking." "Maybe he's planning to heat the county," Pete offered. Laughter, coffee poured, eggs arrived. Everett happened to walk in. That morning he came for coffee on Saturdays, when he remembered to mostly because Delia had told him he needed to be seen in town occasionally, or people would start making up stories. He caught the tail end of the exchange, understood the subject, without needing it explained, and took the empty stool at the far end of the counter. Dottie poured his coffee without being asked. He nodded his thanks. Birch, with the social ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own authority, raised his voice slightly without turning around. "Morning, Marsh. We were just discussing your lumber collection." Everett wrapped both hands around his mug. "I heard. Going to build something with all that?" Birch's tone was genuinely curious beneath the performance of it, the way a man asks a question he's already decided the answer to. Everett took a drink of his coffee, set the mug down. "Tables." The silence lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then Birch laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, and Pete laughed, and three other men at the booth by the window laughed, and the sound moved through the diner with the easy warmth of a community that has found its morning entertainment. "Tables," Birch repeated, "from those crooked boards." "Those crooked boards," Everett said. More laughter. He finished his coffee, left exact change on the counter, and walked back to his truck. He didn't feel embarrassed. He felt, if anything, clarified. There is a particular kind of freedom in being underestimated by people who aren't paying close enough attention. It removes the pressure of their expectations, which leaves room for the actual work. He drove home. He went to the shed. He started table 16. Spring arrived gradually, the way Tennessee springs do, not all at once but in installments, each warm day followed by a cold day that reminded you not to trust the warm days, until eventually the cold days stopped asserting themselves, and the hills went green, and the dogwoods along the fence line opened white as an apology for winter. The Thursday piles were enormous now. Neighbors joked that Everett's land had developed its own topography. The mill had essentially solved its disposal problem entirely, and Clem Rutherford, whenever he saw Everett in town, wore the satisfied expression of a man whose cost column had improved significantly. By April, Everett had completed 23 tables. They stood in the shed and the barn in various states of finish, some raw, some oiled, some fully completed. Every one of them had been made from wood that had come off the Thursday trucks, wood that the mill had been willing to pay to discard wood that two people in the county had looked at with any interest whatsoever: Silas Marsh, who was dead, and Everett Marsh, who was being called the junk man. He entered the county craft fair in May. He rented the smallest available space. He brought one dining table, two benches. He hired a teenager from down the road to help load them, and they drove to the fairground in the early morning while the dew was still on the grass, and they set up without a tent or a sign or anything that would indicate commercial intention, just 3 pieces of furniture on the grass in the morning light. People came. People stop at things that look beautiful even when they're not sure why they're stopping. The table drew people back. They walked past it, turned around, came again, crouched to look at the joinery, stood to take in the proportions. They complimented it. They asked where it came from. Everett told them honestly, the lumber mill next door. People laughed the way you laugh at a good joke, assuming it must be one. Nobody bought. The drive home was long. Not the distance. Millhaven County is not a large geography, but the quality of the silence inside the truck, which had weight to it. He had not, he told himself, expected to sell anything. He had come to see whether people responded to the work. They had responded. That was data. That was an iteration. Delia called that evening. She'd been following the day from Knoxville via a series of text messages that Everett answered in single sentences. They liked them, she said. They didn't buy them. Everett. Her voice had the particular steadiness it got when she was about to say something she meant precisely. They remembered them. He sat on the porch after he hung up in the chair Silas had always used, looking out at the north fence where the oak piles caught the last light and glowed faintly gold. He was 55 years old. He had been wrong before about what things were worth. He had once dismissed a structural solution his junior engineer had proposed, dismissed it on instinct without running the numbers. And the junior engineer had been right, and Everett had spent 3 days rebuilding the calculation from scratch with the specific humility of a man who has confused confidence with competence. He remembered that feeling clearly. The willingness to be wrong was not weakness, it was engineering. He went to bed. He set his alarm. In the morning, he went to the shed. The second craft fair came in August, a regional event held in the next county over, attended by buyers from as far as Knoxville. Everett brought 2 tables, this time different designs. One farmhouse style with straightforward joinery, one with a more pronounced live edge that preserved the full silhouette of the outer ring. He borrowed a small handwritten sign from Delia, who had made it without being asked, because she understood before he did that the work needed to exist in the world rather than only in the shed. The afternoon was hot. He sat in a camp chair beside the tables and answered questions when asked, and drank water from a thermos, and didn't try to sell anything because he had learned from the first fair that the wood did its own work if you let it. Late in the day, an older couple stopped. They stood together in front of the farmhouse table, the woman's hand finding her husband's arm, and they had a conversation Everett couldn't hear over the noise of the fair. The husband crouched to examine the leg construction, reading the joinery, the way a man reads something he wants to understand rather than simply evaluate. He stood up. They conferred again. Then the woman walked over to where Everett sat. "Cash?" she asked. The word arrived simply without preamble, and Everett needed a moment to understand what was being offered. "Yes," he said. They negotiated briefly on price. He named a number Silas's notebooks had suggested based on materials and time, which was substantially below what the table would eventually come to represent in market terms, but was at that moment the only number he knew how to defend. The couple agreed immediately, which told him something about that number he filed away for later. They had a trailer. He helped load the table himself, securing it with straps, making sure the wood wouldn't move in transit. The husband shook his hand. The wife thanked him. They drove away. Everett stood in the fairground with the second table still behind him and watched their trailer turn onto the county road and disappear. The moment had a quality he hadn't anticipated. Not the satisfaction of a transaction, not relief, but something quieter. The table he had made from a piece of wood the mill had been willing to pay to throw away was now going to live in someone's house. Someone had looked at it and decided it was worth keeping. He drove home. He went directly to the shed. He started the next table before he'd even changed his boots. The months that followed had the quality of a man finding his pace, not rushing, not resting, but moving at the speed the work required, which is a different speed than the speed of ambition or the speed of anxiety. Everett worked through the fall and the winter with the methodical regularity of someone who has stopped needing to be convinced of a thing and can simply do it. The Thursday trucks kept coming. He kept moving the wood, sorting it, stacking it with the spacers. He kept refining his technique, guided by the composition books and by the wood itself, which is the better teacher once you've learned to listen to it. A restaurant owner in Millhaven called about tables in October. He delivered 2 in December. A bed and breakfast north of town ordered a set in January. A winery 20 miles east asked about tasting room furniture in the spring. He didn't advertise. He didn't make calls. Every order came from someone who had been in a room with one of his tables and then found him afterward, which he understood to be the most reliable form of evidence available. Not what people say about a thing in the abstract, but what they do about it when they encounter it in person. At Dottie's, the conversation evolved slightly. He was no longer only the junk man. He was now the table man, which Birch Calloway deployed with the same affectionate dismissiveness, but a slightly different inflection, the tone of a man who has moved from bafflement to tolerant incomprehension. "Still making tables from garbage?" Birch asked one Saturday amiably. "Still," Everett said. "I'll never understand it," Birch said, and went back to his eggs, and the matter was settled to his satisfaction, which is how settled matters operate. What Birch couldn't see, what nobody at Dottie's could see, because the evidence wasn't yet visible in any form they knew how to read, was the accumulation happening behind the north fence. Not just of wood, though the piles had by now taken on the scale of something architectural, but of iterations, of refinements too small to name individually, too significant to ignore collectively, of a man teaching himself, through repetition and failure, and the patient instruction of a dead man's notebooks, to see what was already there. It was a February evening, cold and clear in the second winter. Everett was in the shed late, later than usual. The wood stove in the corner had burned down to coals, and he hadn't noticed until his fingers started making mistakes, small errors of pressure and angle that he recognized as the signs of cold and fatigue. He set down his tools. He sat on the stool by the workbench. Around him, the shed held 14 completed tables in various stages of readiness, some oiled and finished, some still raw. The current project sat clamped on the bench, a wide dining table oak, with a live edge that swept in a long arc from one corner across 2/3 of the top. The figure in the wood extraordinary, the kind of pattern that takes a tree 80 years to write. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at his hands, rougher now than they'd ever been as an engineer. The palms calloused differently from the grip of planes and chisels, the knuckles bearing the small scars of learning. He was 54 years old. He had spent the last 2 years doing something that his professional training had not prepared him for, that his community didn't take seriously, that produced no immediate financial return sufficient to justify the hours involved, that he had told himself was temporary for approximately the first 6 months before he'd stopped telling himself that. Delia had called that afternoon. Her voice had been careful in the way it gets when she's decided to say a necessary thing. Everett, you've been out there 2 years. The property taxes are coming. Is this something that's going anywhere? Or are you just, she paused. You can just say if you want to sell it. There's no shame in it. Silas would understand. He hadn't answered immediately. He'd said he'd think about it. He'd hung up. He'd gone to the shed. Now he sat on the stool in the cooling air, looking at the table on the bench, and the tables against the walls, and the composition books stacked open on the shelf above the hand planes. And he understood something with a clarity that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with what it costs a man to admit. He's been wrong about what he wants. He had spent 30 years being competent at something that mattered to other people. This was something that mattered to him. Not because it was profitable, not because the county approved, because when he stood at this bench with a hand plane moving across white oak and the shaving curled up thin as thought, and the grain revealed itself, he was the most present he had ever been in his life. He had not known until 2 years ago that he had been for 30 years partially somewhere else. He opened one of Silas's notebooks to a page he had read a dozen times. The sentence underlined twice at the bottom. Straight boards build houses. Interesting boards build heirlooms. He read it once more in the cold quiet of the shed. Then he got up, put more wood in the stove, and picked up his plane. He didn't call Delia back that night. He called her the next morning early before she left for work. I'm not selling, he said. A pause. Then quietly, with the warmth of someone who had been hoping for exactly this answer. Okay, Everett. I need more time. You've got it. The wood is Delia. The wood is something. He stopped. He had never said this out loud before. What Silas saw in it, I think I'm starting to see it too. Delia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, not careful, not measured, but something closer to relief. He always said you would. Everett held the phone after she hung up, standing on the porch in the cold February morning, with the hills going blue in the early light and the oak piles behind the north fence, catching the first sun pale cream and gold. Stacked patient in enormous 13 months of Thursday deliveries of what the county had decided was worthless, and what one man in a cold shed was learning iteration by iteration to see clearly for the first time. He went inside, made coffee, pulled on his boots. He went back to the shed. The spring craft fair was in April. He signed up for the same small plot. He brought one dining table, 2 benches. He wrote nothing on the sign Delia had made, added nothing to it. The wood he had come to understand, no need for additional introduction. People stopped. People put their hands on the surface. People asked where it came from, and he told them, and they laughed the way they always laughed, because the answer seemed like it couldn't be right. The fair ran through the afternoon. The light changed from bright to golden as the sun moved west, and in that golden light, the grain in the oak tabletop did what it always did. At that hour, it deepened. It shifted the figure, moving from pale cream into something closer to amber. The rings of 80 years of Tennessee tree visible in the surface as clearly as a map. Nobody bought. He loaded the tables back onto the truck as the fair shut down around him, lifting the benches in with the practiced ease of a man who has loaded these things before wrapping the corners in moving pads. The teenager he'd hired wasn't there this time. He'd managed alone. He drove home in the early evening with the windows down and the radio off. There was a moment stopped at the single traffic light in Millhaven's small downtown when the doubt arrived. Not catastrophically, just present. The light held red and the truck idled, and Everett sat with his hands on the wheel and thought with full honesty about what 2.5 years of this had produced: some beautiful furniture in a shed, a community's affectionate ridicule, and one dining table sold to a retired couple for a price he now understood was significantly below what it should have been. He was 55 years old. He had enough savings to continue this for a while, but a while was not indefinite. The light changed green. He drove through it. The farm came into view over the next rise, the house, the barn, the shed, and beyond the north fence, the piles of white oak catching the last light. Enormous patient representing 13 months of what the mill had considered worthless. And what Everett Marsh was beginning to understand was not worthless at all. He pulled into the drive, sat for a moment, looked at the shed. Then he got out of the truck, walked to the shed, opened the door, and went back to work. The second craft fair sold one table. That fact lived in Everett's mind not as a triumph, but as a data point, modest specific worth, neither celebration nor dismissal. The retired couple had wanted something real, something that didn't feel manufactured, something their grandchildren might still be eating dinner on 40 years from now. They had recognized it. One couple out of several hundred fairground visitors represented a very small percentage, but percentages were not the relevant metric at this stage. The relevant metric was whether the thing could be recognized at all. It could. That was sufficient to continue. The restaurant order came in October of that year, a Tuesday phone call from the owner of Millhaven's only sit-down establishment beyond the diner. He ran a modest farm-to-table operation on the east side of town, 30 seats, wood floors, the kind of place that understood its own aesthetic. He wanted 2 tables for the front room. He wanted them in white oak. He had seen what Everett made. He didn't want anything else. Everett delivered them in December, 2 weeks before Christmas. The owner walked around each table the way a man walks around something he intends to live with for a long time, checking the proportions from every angle, running his thumb along the joinery at the corners. He said nothing for nearly 3 minutes. Then, "These are exactly right." He paid immediately full price, shook Everett's hand with both of his. On the drive home, Everett noted something he hadn't expected to note. The price paid without hesitation was twice what the retired couple had paid at the fair, which meant his original number had been wrong in a direction he hadn't calculated. He filed that away. He adjusted his pricing model. He went to the shed. Through the winter, the orders arrived in the slow cadence of things that spread by word of mouth, infrequent, genuine, impossible to manufacture. The Millhaven Bed and Breakfast ordered a set of 4 tables for its dining room in January. A winery 20 miles east called in March a place called Harlan Ridge that had been open 5 years operating out of a converted tobacco barn, and the owner wanted furniture for her tasting room that matched the building's character. Everett drove out to look at the space before agreeing to anything. He stood in the tobacco barn for 20 minutes without speaking, reading the proportions of the room, the height of the ceiling, the quality of light through the south-facing windows. He drove home. He pulled 6 slabs from the Thursday pile selected for grain character rather than dimensional regularity, the way you select for the specific problem rather than the general solution. He delivered the tasting room furniture in May. The winery owner, a woman named Patricia Lorne, who had the no-nonsense precision of someone who had built a business with her own hands, stood in the center of the room after the last piece was in place. She turned slowly, taking the full view. Her voice carried something that wasn't quite surprise, more like confirmation of a thing she'd suspected but needed to see. "People are going to ask about this furniture before they ask about the wine." She was right. Everett learned this not from Patricia, but from the first customer who called him after visiting Harlan Ridge, a man who introduced himself on the phone as Desmond Hale. The call came on a Wednesday morning in late October of the year 2000. Everett was in the shed oiling a tabletop when he heard the phone ring in the house. He finished the section he was working, cleaned the rag, then walked in. The message on the machine identified the caller as Desmond Hale, Nashville Interior Design, and asked if Everett might be available to receive a visitor. The voice was measured, unhurried, the voice of a man comfortable with silence. Everett returned the call. He confirmed Thursday afternoon. He said nothing to anyone about it. Desmond arrived in a gray truck that had more miles on it than the paint suggested it should, which told Everett something useful before the man got out. He was somewhere in his late 40s, lean, wearing work clothes rather than the Design World uniform Everett had vaguely anticipated, and he moved through the property the way people move through spaces. They're assessing professionally, slowly, with stops, with attention paid to things that most visitors would walk past without registering. He spent a long time at the stacked slabs behind the north fence. He picked up 2 pieces, turned them, set them back. He looked at the arrangement of the stacks, the spacers, the organization by thickness, without commenting. He walked into the shed without being invited, which Everett didn't mind, because he recognized it as the behavior of someone who was actually looking rather than performing the act of looking. He went around the shed interior, methodically examining finish tables, reading joinery corners, crouching to look at leg construction. He opened the door on the small finishing area in the back and stood there for a moment before closing it again. Then he stopped beside the dining table currently on the bench. The widest piece Everett had made, a slab of white oak 4 feet across at its widest point, the live edge preserved in full, the surface finished in oil that had brought the grain to a depth you could almost see into. Desmond leaned forward, both forearms resting on the edge, studying the surface from a low angle where the light caught every variation in the figure. He stayed in that position for a long moment. Everett waited. Desmond finally straightened. "This isn't scrap wood." Everett held his gaze. "I know." Another pause, the kind that has content in it. Desmond's eyes moved once more around the shed, the finished tables, the stacked lumber visible through the window, the composition books on the shelf above the workbench, the hand planes on their pegs. Then, with the directness of a man who has made his assessment, have you ever considered selling outside the county? The question had a specific gravity to it. Everett felt it land. He had been asked versions of this question before in the sense that Delia had wondered aloud about it, in the sense that he had wondered about it himself in the peripheral way you wonder about things you're not ready to pursue. But hearing it from someone who had driven from Nashville after sitting in a tasting room at Harlan Ridge, hearing it from someone who understood what he was looking at gave the question a different character entirely. It stopped being speculative. It became structural. "Tell me what you're thinking," Everett said. What Desmond was thinking became clear over the following hour. He worked with clients across Tennessee into Georgia, into the Carolinas, hotels, restaurants, private residences that had budgets for furniture, commensurate with their conviction that the right table changes a room the way a good sentence changes a paragraph. He had been looking for a maker, not a manufacturer. The distinction mattered enormously to the people he worked with, something made by a person in a place, from a material with a legible history. Everett's tables had all three. The wood came from a specific county. The maker was a specific man. The history was visible in the grain. "There's a regional exhibition in Nashville in April," Desmond said. "Furniture design interiors. Not a craft fair buyers come to this. Designers, hotel buyers, restaurant groups." He let the distinction settle. 3 tables would be enough, maybe 4. Everett considered the proposal with the same methodical attention he'd given to Clem Rutherford's request 8 years earlier, cost-benefit structural integrity. The cost was a borrowed trailer fuel 2 days. The benefit was entirely unknown, which was its own kind of information. Unknown benefit meant uncontrolled variables, which was not how an engineer preferred to operate. But he had been in Millhaven County for 8 years, teaching himself that the uncontrolled variables were frequently where the actual story lived. He declined initially. He told Desmond he needed to think about it. Delia called 2 evenings later, having heard about the visit from Everett himself in the brief summary he'd offered, and she applied the particular logic she developed over a lifetime of watching her brother overthink tractable problems. "Everett, you have tables in a shed. He has buyers in a room. What exactly needs more thought?" He drove the borrowed trailer to Nashville on an April morning that was overcast but dry. He had 3 tables, the wide dining slab that Desmond had examined, a farmhouse table with traditional joinery, executed with more precision than his early work, a trestle table with a pronounced live edge on both sides that he'd built from a matched pair of slabs from the same tree. Each piece had come from the Thursday pile. Each piece had come from wood the mill had paid to discard. The exhibition hall occupied a converted warehouse in an industrial neighborhood south of downtown. Everett found his assigned space, a 20 by 20 footprint, marked with tape on the concrete floor, set up his 3 tables without a backdrop or display lighting or any of the visual infrastructure that surrounded him on all sides. He placed his handwritten sign at the front edge of the space. He sat in his camp chair. He waited. The people who came to this event were not craft fair people. They moved differently, with purpose, with evaluation in their bearing, stopping not because something was pretty, but because something registered as significant. Everett noticed the quality of attention he was receiving from the first hour. These were not people who touched the wood tentatively. They touched it the way Whitfield had, the way Patricia Lorne had, the way Desmond had, with the hands of people who understand what they're feeling for. By noon, 2 of the 3 tables had been spoken for. Not sold, spoken for, with deposits offered by 2 separate buyers who both expressed an interest in ordering more. Everett took the deposits, wrote out receipts on the notepad he'd brought for exactly this purpose, accepted business cards. By mid-afternoon, the 3rd table was gone. He was sitting in his camp chair beside an empty footprint of floor when a woman in her 40s stopped at the edge of his space, looked at the 3 absent tables, looked at the sign, looked at Everett. "You sold out," she said. It wasn't a question. "This morning." She reached into her bag, produced a card. "I designed for 3 boutique hotel properties in Tennessee. I've been looking for a furniture maker for 2 years." She glanced at the empty floor again. "Can you produce more?" The question settled on him with a weight he recognized. It was the same weight as Desmond's question about selling outside the county, the weight of a thing becoming real. Everett looked at the card in his hand. He thought of the north fence. He thought of the Thursday trucks, 8 years of them, the piles that had never fully diminished regardless of how much he worked through. "Yes," he said. He drove home with an empty trailer, a notebook full of contacts, a deposit in his pocket, 3 firm orders in the particular clarity that arrives when the thing you've been building in private is suddenly irrevocably part of the world. He called Delia from the driveway. Her response arrived in 3 syllables. There it is. The following months required decisions of a kind Everett hadn't made since managing large construction projects. The volume of interest from the Nashville exhibition outpaced what one man in a shed could produce, even working the hours he'd been working. He needed help. Not the teenage labor he'd been using for loading. He needed craftsmen. People who could learn the joinery, learn the finishing, learn to read the wood the way he'd spent 8 years learning to read it. He hired 2 men in the fall, both in their late 20s, both from the county. Tatum Briggs had been framing houses for 6 years and had the dimensional precision the work required. Lyle Okafor had done cabinetry work in Knoxville and understood wood movement in ways that meant Everett didn't have to start from zero. He didn't hire them as employees in the conventional sense. He hired them as students of the process, with the explicit understanding that they would learn his methods, which were Silas's methods, which were the methods of the composition books. He opened the shed to include the barn's lower floor, creating a connected workspace that could handle multiple projects simultaneously without anyone getting in anyone's way. He installed a proper dust collection system. He built a dedicated finishing area with better ventilation than the back corner of the shed had provided. The Thursday piles began for the first time since 1992 to visibly diminish. Clem Rutherford showed up on a Tuesday morning in November, ostensibly to confirm the following week's delivery schedule, but in practice to see what was happening. He stood in the doorway of the expanded workspace, watching Tatum fit a mortise joint with a mallet, watching Lyle plane a surface in long, smooth strokes, watching Everett at the bench reviewing a design drawing. Clem worked his cap brim with the same gesture he'd deployed years ago on Everett's front porch, the gesture of a man recalibrating. "We used to pay thousands a month to get rid of this material," Clem said, not loudly, mostly to himself. Everett looked up from the drawing. "I remember." Clem shook his head slowly. "Now we're delivering your inventory." "Looks that way." Something passed across Clem's face, not quite regret, not quite admiration, something more complex than either. He put his cap back on. He confirmed next week's delivery. He drove back to the mill. The orders moved steadily. The boutique hotel buyer ordered 6 sets of tables for 3 properties. A restaurant group in Chattanooga commissioned a custom installation. Referrals came from referrals exactly as they always had, the network growing through direct contact with the work rather than through any promotional mechanism Everett had deployed. He still ran no advertisements. He had no website. He had a phone number on a card that Desmond had printed for him after the Nashville exhibition, and that was the entire extent of his marketing infrastructure. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. The orders outpaced capacity, which produced a waiting list, which produced the opposite problem from the one he'd had at the first craft fair. He was not unknown. He was inaccessible. There is a market for inaccessible. The crisis arrived in February of the following year, arriving not loudly but with the quiet destructiveness of water finding a crack. A hotel group in Memphis had placed the largest order Everett had ever accepted: 6 complete dining sets, 12 chairs, 2 sideboards. The timeline was aggressive but achievable, and he'd confirmed it with the confidence of a man who understood what his operation could do. What he had underestimated was what his operation could do with 2 additional people who had not yet fully internalized the finishing standards. Lyle had been doing excellent work. Tatum had developed quickly. But on this particular order, Tatum had applied the final oil finish to 3 table surfaces at the wrong temperature in a section of the workspace that caught afternoon sun through a gap in the barn siding. The oil had cured inconsistently, leaving surfaces that caught the light wrong, not visibly catastrophic to an untrained eye, but wrong in the way that things are wrong when the person who made them knows exactly what right is supposed to look like. Everett found it on a Wednesday morning inspection the week before delivery. He stood at the 3 tables for a long time. He ran his hand across each surface. He took a breath. He called the hotel contact in Memphis. He explained the situation without euphemism. There was a finishing defect on 3 pieces. He was not comfortable delivering them in current condition. He needed 2 additional weeks. The contact was not happy. The hotel was opening in 6 weeks. Everett absorbed the displeasure without flinching. He had managed clients on construction projects for 30 years. And he understood that the short-term discomfort of a delay was manageable in a way that the long-term consequence of delivering work he wasn't proud of was not. He refunded a portion of the deposit for the inconvenience. He stripped the 3 surfaces. He refinished them himself in the early morning before the temperature in the workspace climbed, which was when Silas's notebooks had specified oil finishing should be done cool air, low humidity, patient hands. He delivered 2 weeks later. The hotel contact met him at the door of the property with the energy of someone who has been made to wait and wants that acknowledged. He walked with her through the dining room as each piece was placed, watched her face change as the tables went in, watched the room become what it was supposed to be. She stood in the center of the room when the last piece was positioned. "Okay," she said with the tone of someone revising a position. "Okay, these are worth waiting for." Everett drove home with the revised understanding that his operations capacity was not simply a function of physical space or the number of people working in it. It was a function of how thoroughly each person understood the standards, which meant the expansion of his workforce was not a management problem, but an educational one. He sat at the kitchen table that evening with one of Silas's composition books open in front of him, and he wrote 3 pages of his own notes on what the Memphis situation had clarified, because that was what the composition books had always been. Not manuals, but records of learning evidence that the person writing them had paid for every piece of knowledge they contained. He implemented a change the following Monday. No piece left the workshop without his hands on the final surface. Not a check from a distance. Hands on the wood. Every time. The magazine call came in the spring from an editorial assistant at a publication called American Home and Craft based in New York. A photographer named Stuart Bellis had apparently stopped at Harlan Ridge Winery the previous fall on a personal trip through Tennessee. He had spent, according to the assistant's account, approximately 30 minutes examining a table in the tasting room before asking Patricia Lorne for Everett's contact information. Patricia had given it without hesitation, because she was that kind of woman. Stuart Bellis arrived in April with 2 camera bags, a reflector minimal conversation, and the particular economy of movement of someone who doesn't waste time on things that don't matter. He spent a full day. He photographed the furniture, the stacked lumber, the hand tools on their pegs, the composition books open on the workbench, the old drying shed's Tatum fitting a joint. Lyle planing. He photographed Everett's hands, not Everett's face, just his hands on the wood, which was the correct editorial decision, the one that understood where the story actually lived. At the end of the day, Stuart photographed the north fence with the oak piles beyond it. In the afternoon light, the slabs stacked in their rows with the spacers Everett had been placing since the first Thursday delivery in 1992. He spent 10 minutes on that shot, adjusting his position, waiting for the light to do what he needed it to do. Before he left, he shook Everett's hand. "This is the best story I've found in 3 years of doing this," he said. Then he got in his car and he drove north, and that was all. The issue came out in October. Everett received a copy in the mail sent by the editorial assistant with a note marking the page number. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the magazine to the spread. It ran 6 pages. Stuart had photographed the tasting room table at Harlan Ridge in the establishing shot wide. The live edge, catching the afternoon light, then moved through the sequence of images in a way that told the story without words, needing to carry it. The piles, the tools, the hands, the shed, the finished furniture. The text was minimal, a single column running beside the images. It described where the wood came from, what had been done with it, who had done it. Everett read it twice. He set the magazine on the table. He called Delia. Her response, "I'm buying 50 copies." The email came the next day, then more emails. Then within a week, a volume of email that Everett's phone could not process fast enough, arriving from addresses in New York, Chicago, California, Texas addresses, representing design firms, hotel groups, restaurant owners, residential clients with names he didn't recognize, but whose messages shared a consistent quality. They had seen the piece, they had recognized something in it. They wanted to know if he could make something for them. Delia drove up from Knoxville the following weekend. She had been, she explained without preamble, learning to use a spreadsheet program because it was apparent that somebody needed to manage what was happening. She sat up at the kitchen table with her laptop and worked through the inquiry list while Everett stood behind her reading over her shoulder, occasionally identifying which inquiries seemed serious and which seemed speculative. The serious inquiries outnumbered the speculative ones by a ratio that surprised them both. "You need 2 more people," Delia said, not looking up from the screen. "Minimum." Everett looked at the spreadsheet at the column of names at the dates she'd inserted, representing realistic delivery timelines based on his current capacity. The dates extended 16 months into the future. "I know. You need a website." "I know. You need a phone that isn't from 2003. He didn't answer that one. He walked to the shed. He hired two more people in November. A woman named Vera Stokes, who had been building custom cabinetry for a contractor in Knoxville, and who moved through a workspace with the efficiency of someone who has never had the luxury of being slow. A man named Gus Pemberton, 57 years old, semi-retired from a furniture factory in Cookville, who had spent 30 years in production work building things he hadn't designed to tolerances he hadn't set, and who sat across from Everett at the kitchen table at the hiring interview with the careful dignity of a man offering something he wasn't sure would be valued. Everett asked him two questions: could he work by hand rather than by machine? And could he learn a new standard rather than defaulting to the production habits he'd built over 30 years? Gus said yes to both without blinking, and the steadiness in his eyes when he said it was the answer Everett was actually evaluating. 4 people in the workshop now. The barn floor fully configured. The Thursday piles moving faster than they'd ever moved. Not depleted, the mill's output was too consistent for depletion, but genuinely diminishing between deliveries. Each Thursday's load absorbed into the production cycle within 2 weeks, rather than sitting in the pile for months. Delia sent a link to the website she'd built in December. She had done it herself quietly without asking for input, because she understood her brother's relationship with self-promotion well enough to know that asking would produce a conversation rather than a website. The site had 4 pages: the work, the material, the process, a contact form. The photographs were Stuart Bellis's license through the magazine for a fee Delia had negotiated with characteristic directness. There were no prices listed. There was no order form. There was only the work, visible and specific, with a contact form at the bottom for people who had seen enough to want to know more. The waiting list extended to 8 months by February. Delia drove up on a Thursday, coincidentally delivery day arriving just as the mill truck was backing through the north gate. She stood on the porch with a coffee watching the dump bed rise, the slabs cascading down into the organized stacks. She had a folder under her arm that she'd been carrying since Knoxville, and she waited until the truck was gone before handing it to Everett. Inside the folder was a printed stack of the inquiry emails she'd been managing, organized by category. At the top of the stack was one she'd flagged with a paperclip. The sender was a company called Hearthstone Home. The message was brief, professional, and came from an address identifying the sender as the director of sourcing. It said in essentially these terms that Hearthstone had become aware of Everett's work through the American Home and Craft article, that the company was developing a collection centered on authentic American craftsmanship, that they would like to discuss whether a partnership might be possible, and that they could send a representative at his convenience. Everett read the message twice. He looked at the Hearthstone name on the top of the page. He knew the company. Everyone in America who had ever been inside a furniture store knew Hearthstone Home. He handed the folder back to Delia. She watched him. Well, he looked toward the north fence at the fresh piles from that morning's delivery, pale cream oak in the winter light. He thought about what 8 months of waiting list meant in terms of the gap between what he could make with 4 people in a barn and what Hearthstone's kind of distribution implied. The gap was not bridgeable with additional staff alone. It implied something structural, a change in the nature of the operation, which was a change in the nature of the question he'd been answering for the past 8 years. Invite them, he said. Delia pulled out her phone immediately before he could reconsider. The confirmation email from Hearthstone arrived the following afternoon. A team would visit on a Tuesday morning in 3 weeks. The team would include Stuart Vance, director of sourcing, whose name Everett wrote on a notepad and then set aside. He told Tatum, Lyle, Vera, and Gus that they were having visitors, that the visitors were potential buyers, and that nothing about how the day proceeded should be different from any other Tuesday. They all nodded. Tatum asked if he should wear a different shirt. Everett looked at him. Tatum took the look correctly. 3 weeks passed in the normal rhythm of the work. Tables built, surfaces, plain joints, fitted, oil applied in cool morning air with patient hands. The Thursday truck came. Delia sent 3 more emails from buyers she was managing, asking for timeline estimates, and Everett answered them with specific delivery dates rather than approximations, because a specific date is a commitment, and a commitment is a form of respect for the person waiting. He spent the evenings in the shed working later than usual, not because the Hearthstone visit had produced anxiety, but because the work was where he thought most clearly, where the variables sorted themselves into manageable categories. He was 61 years old. He had been in Millhaven County for 9 years. He had gone from being the junk man to having an 8-month waiting list from clients across 4 states, none of whom had been reached through anything except the word of someone who had put their hands on the furniture. The question was not whether to meet with Hearthstone. He had already answered that. The question, the one he turned over in the evenings, the way he turned a piece of lumber looking for the grain, looking for what it would do under pressure, was what he was willing to give up in exchange for what they were offering. Because everything of genuine value requires that calculation. And the men who get it wrong are usually the ones who didn't take the time to know precisely what they were trading away. He opened Silas's notebook to the back pages where the older man had written observations about the work rather than instructions for performing it. One passage written in the cramped hand of someone who'd had to think carefully about each word before committing it to paper. The wood doesn't care what you intend. It only responds to what you actually do. Same is true of most things worth doing. Everett read it once, closed the book, set it on the shelf above the hand planes in its place between the other composition books, the ones that had been there when Silas left the shed for the last time. He went back to the bench. He picked up his plane. The shaving came up thin, and beneath it the grain of the white oak revealed itself in the lamplight, not swirling, not dramatic, just present. Patient. A record of everything the tree had been through, written in a language that only a certain kind of attention could read. The Tuesday morning came gray with the persistent drizzle of a Tennessee late winter that can't quite decide to commit to rain. They arrived at 9 in the morning, 4 of them in a rented sedan that had no business navigating the gravel drive at anything above 10 miles an hour. Everett watched from the kitchen window as they parked carefully beside the barn, as if uncertain whether the ground would hold. 3 of them were in their 30s, carrying laptops in padded bags, wearing the studied casual clothing of people who work in offices that have exposed brick. The 4th stepped out last. Stuart Vance was somewhere in his late 50s, heavier than his title suggested he should be, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who stopped needing to prove things to rooms a long time ago. He looked at the barn. He looked at the north fence, at the oak piles beyond it in the gray morning light. He looked at the shed. He did all of this before he looked at Everett, who had come out onto the porch. Everett came down the steps. They shook hands. Vance's grip was brief, direct, the handshake of someone who considers the gesture informational rather than performative. "Thank you for having us," Vance said. Everett nodded toward the barn. "Come in." He gave no tour. He didn't narrate what they were seeing. He opened the barn door, stepped back, let them enter, let the space announce itself. Tatum was at the bench fitting a leg joint. Lyle was running a hand plane across a tabletop in the long rhythmic strokes that after 3 years had become as natural to him as breathing. Vera was in the finishing area applying oil to a set of surfaces with a lint-free cloth, moving in the patient circles the process required. Gus was at the back, assembling a trestle base fitting the cross member with mallet strikes so measured you could have set a metronome to them. The Hearthstone team moved through the space with their laptops mostly closed, which told Everett they were in an information gathering phase rather than a documentation phase. 2 of the younger ones took photographs with their phones, the joinery, the wood surface, the hand tools, the stacked lumber visible through the window. Vance walked slowly, stopping at each station without interrupting the work, watching with the attention of someone whose job requires him to distinguish between craftsmanship that photographs well and craftsmanship that will survive 20 years of daily use by families who don't think about furniture. He spent the most time at the large dining table positioned near the center of the barn floor. The piece Everett had been working toward for 6 weeks, a slab of white oak 4.5 feet across, at its widest 8 feet in length, the live edge on one side following a curve so gradual it seemed less like a natural boundary than like a deliberate design choice. The surface was finished, the grain reading at full depth, the figure in the wood shifting from tight cathedral grain at the center to wide-open ray fleck near the edges where the saw had caught the growth rings at an angle. Vance stood at the head of the table. He gripped the edge with both hands the way a man grips something he is testing for solidity and leaned his weight against it, slowly reading the structure through his palms rather than his eyes. When he straightened, what was in his face was not the evaluative neutrality of a purchasing executive managing his position in a negotiation. It was simpler than that, more involuntary. "This is exactly what we're looking for," he said. The room continued its work around them, unhearing or pretending to be. Everett held Vance's gaze. He had learned over years of managing construction projects, and over more years of managing the slower, more complicated project of his own conviction, that the moment when someone tells you what they want is not the moment to speak. It is the moment to listen to everything they haven't said yet. Vance straightened. He looked around the barn once more, a full, slow survey, then back at Everett. "We're launching a collection next spring, built around authentic American craftsmanship. made in America by hand from domestic materials with makers who have a story attached to the work. He paused. Your story is exactly right. Everett asked how many pieces they were discussing. The answer arrived through the younger team members who opened their laptops with the efficiency of people who had been waiting to be useful. The initial collection would feature 6 to 8 distinct pieces across their dining category. Hearthstone operated 214 retail locations in 41 states. The collection would appear in flagship stores in all major markets in the online catalog in the seasonal print materials. Production volume for the first year was estimated in a range that Everett let settle in his mind without reacting to it, because the number was large enough that his first reaction would have been inaccurate. He walked them through the process questions methodically. Wood sourcing the Thursday deliveries from Millhaven Lumber Mill, as they had been since 1992. White oak offcuts too irregular for dimensional use material the mill had once paid to discard. Finishing oil-based hand-applied the formula in Silas's composition books, adjusted over 12 years of practice, but fundamentally unchanged. Joinery hand-cut, where the design specified it. Machine-assisted only for operations where the machine introduced no compromise to the final structure or surface. Production capacity at current staffing, he gave them an honest number. Vance's team made notes. Vance himself made no notes. He watched Everett the way you watch a structure you're considering trusting with weight, not the surface, but the underlying geometry. The proposal Hearthstone sent the following week was thorough, detailed, written in the language of people who move significant money through supply chains and understand how to document the movement. Everett read it at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, Delia on the phone with him the second evening, as he went through sections she'd already flagged. The proposal contained one requirement that was non-negotiable on their end. To meet the volume projections, a portion of the production would need to move to a facility outside Millhaven County. Hearthstone had relationships with several domestic manufacturers who could execute to specification in Tennessee or neighboring states. The Millhaven workshop would remain the creative origin, the design, the direction, the quality standard. But the volume required manufacturing scale that 4 people in a barn could not provide. Everett read that section 3 times. He set the document down. He walked to the shed, which was where he went when a problem needed space rather than analysis. He stood at the workbench without touching anything, looking at the composition books on the shelf, looking at the hand planes on their pegs. The proposal was asking him to separate the thing from the idea of the thing, to attach his name to work that would be made by people he hadn't trained in a facility he hadn't built, using methods he couldn't monitor with his own hands. The furniture would be called Marsh. It would not be made the way Marsh furniture was made. The distinction was invisible to most buyers. It was not invisible to him. He called Vance directly, bypassing the team using the cell number on the business card rather than the office line. Vance answered on the second ring. Everett spoke without preamble. The manufacturing requirement, that's not possible. A pause. Walk me through your concern. Everything with my name on it is made here, by people I've trained, from material I've selected. That's not a preference, it's the reason the work is what it is. He kept his voice even, the voice of a man stating a load calculation rather than making an argument. You separate the production from the standard, you lose the thing you came here for. The story stops being true. Another pause longer. Vance's silences had weight in them, the weight of a man actually thinking rather than formulating a response. The volume we're projecting, I'll build to the volume I can build to. You put it in the collection at honest numbers. We grow the capacity here in Millhaven as the demand justifies it. Everett looked through the barn window at the north fence at the oak piles in the late afternoon light. The wood isn't going anywhere. The mill runs every Thursday. The negotiation that followed took 3 months. Hearthstone sent 2 more teams, one focused on the supply chain questions, one focused on quality documentation. Everett answered every question fully without embellishment, providing the same kind of structural transparency he'd have provided on a bridge inspection report. Here is what exists, here is how it was built, here is what it will bear. He did not yield on the production location. He did not yield on the material sourcing. He did not yield on the finishing standards, which he documented in a 12-page technical brief that drew heavily from Silas's composition books, translated from the older man's language into specifications a quality assurance team could verify. Delia sat across the kitchen table from him during the final negotiation call, listening. She made no sounds. She drank her coffee. When the call ended, she set down her mug. They agreed, she said. They agreed. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she reserved for moments when she wanted to say something significant, but understood that what the moment required was silence. Then Silas would have been insufferable about this. Everett almost smiled. He would have acted like he expected it. He did expect it. Delia wrapped both hands around her mug. He just didn't know it would be you. The contract was signed in October of 2004. Production for the Hearthstone collection, officially titled the Millhaven Oak Collection in the catalog copy, which was Vance's decision, and one Everett approved of, without saying so, would begin in January of 2005, with the first pieces reaching showrooms in April. Everett hired 3 more people through the winter, bringing the workshop to 7, and the training process he put them through was not accelerated to meet the timeline. It was conducted at the pace the work required because he had learned from the Memphis situation that the timeline was a variable he could manage, but the standard was not. Gus Pemberton turned out to be the most valuable hire he'd ever made. Not for the obvious reason that Gus was technically excellent, he was, but for the less obvious reason that Gus understood institutional knowledge and how to transfer it. He had spent 30 years in a production environment where knowledge lived in individuals rather than in systems, where it walked out the door when someone retired, where every generation had to relearn what the previous generation had known. He helped Everett build training protocols that embedded the standard in the process, rather than in any single person's hands. It was unglamorous administrative work, the kind that produces no visible output until the day it prevents a failure. The day Everett watched Gus demonstrate the oil finishing process to a new hire, the temperature considerations, the cloth preparation, the stroke sequence, the patience, the final inspection required, he recognized something he hadn't anticipated. The composition books weren't just documents of what Silas had known. They were a model of how to make knowledge transmissible. Silas had understood that a craftsman who keeps his knowledge in his head serves only his own lifetime. A craftsman who writes it down serves everyone who comes after. Everett went home that evening and began writing his own notebook. Not a copy of Silas's, he had Silas's. His own, documenting what 12 years of practice had added to what the composition books had given him. The refinements, the failures that had produced refinements, the specific properties of the oak that came off Millhaven Mill's trucks, which was not identical to generic white oak, in the way that a specific place is never identical to a general category. He wrote carefully, in the same slanted hand that years of drafting had given him, making sure each thing he wrote was complete enough to be useful to someone who hadn't been there when he learned it. The Millhaven Oak Collection reached Hearthstone Home Showrooms in April of 2005. Everett knew this because Stuart Vance sent a brief email confirming the dates, and because the inquiry volume through the website, which Delia now managed with a focused efficiency that had evolved far beyond the original 4-page version, spiked in a way that corresponded precisely with the opening of the spring season catalog. What Everett didn't know, because nobody in Millhaven County had yet connected the relevant pieces of information, was what was happening inside a Hearthstone Home showroom in Nashville on a Saturday morning in late April. Birch Calloway had driven to Nashville with his wife Norma for what he'd described to Pete Larson the previous Thursday morning at Dottie's as a furniture shopping trip, motivated by the fact that their dining room table had developed a wobble that he'd been meaning to address for 3 years. Norma had reached the end of her tolerance for the wobble and had communicated this in terms that made the trip non-negotiable. They had several stores to visit. Hearthstone Home was on Norma's list because she had seen their catalog at the dentist's office. The showroom was large, well-lit, organized in the manner of all Hearthstone locations. Room vignettes arranged to suggest lives of comfortable aspiration. Birch moved through it with the impatience of a man who has farmed 300 acres for 30 years and finds retail environments slightly unreal, reading price tags with the expression of someone confirming a suspicion. Norma moved more carefully, stopping at things, thinking about them. She stopped in the center of the showroom. She stopped so suddenly that Birch, who had been following at a distance, nearly walked into her. Birch! Her voice had an unusual quality, not alarm, something quieter than alarm. She was looking at a dining table positioned on a raised platform at the room's focal point, lit from above by pendant lights that had been positioned by someone who understood what the light would do to that particular surface. The table was white oak, wide, live-edged, the grain reading at full depth in the warm light. The figure moving across the surface in the patterns that 80 years of a Tennessee hillside had written into it. Birch looked at the table. He looked at the price on the small card beside it. Then he looked at the other card, the one that identified the collection, the material, the maker. Millhaven Oak Collection, handcrafted by Everett Marsh Workshop, Millhaven County, Tennessee. He read it. He read it again. Norma's voice arrived from somewhere beside him, carrying the specific warmth of a woman whose husband has been wrong about something for a very long time. "I think that's your junk man, Birch." He stood in front of the table without responding. He reached out and ran 2 fingers slowly along the edge of the surface, not testing it, not evaluating it, simply making contact with something that had just required him to revise a 13-year-old opinion in a furniture showroom in Nashville. The grain was right there under his fingertips, patient, complete. 12 years of Thursday mornings assembled into this one surface under lights designed to show it exactly as it was. No, he said. The word came out quietly, lacking the conviction it was reaching for. They drove back to Millhaven in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was very full. Birch spent it looking out the window at the interstate at the Tennessee hills going green in the late afternoon, at the exits he'd driven past 100 times at nothing in particular. He was a man who formed opinions quickly, held them confidently, and revised them slowly. The revision was happening now in real time, and it was not a small revision. It was the kind that requires a man to go back through a long sequence of easy assumptions and find the place where the evidence had been visible, and he had chosen not to look at it directly. Monday morning arrived at Dottie's with its usual cast. The coffee already poured, the eggs already ordered, the particular gravitational field of the front counter already established by 7:15. Birch came in carrying a Hearthstone home catalog that Norma had taken from the showroom, tucked under his arm, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that what he's carrying needs to be witnessed. He set it on the counter without introduction. Pete Larson looked at it. He looked at Birch. He looked back at the catalog. Birch opened it to the page he'd already found, the double-page spread for the Millhaven Oak collection. The photograph of the dining table in the showroom, taken from a high angle that showed the full surface and the figure in the grain, the smaller photographs of the joinery details, the workshop, Everett's hands on the wood. Everett Marsh Workshop, Millhaven County, Tennessee. The counter went quiet. Not the brief quiet of a lull in conversation, but the sustained quiet of a room that has just received information it doesn't know immediately how to process. Someone at the far booth stood up to look. Pete picked up the catalog. He read the page. He set it down. He built that. The voice was not identified, just present, coming from somewhere to the left of the register. Birch nodded once slowly, the nod of a man confirming rather than claiming. By noon, the catalog had been passed through every table in the diner. By mid-afternoon, the information had reached the hardware store, the insurance office, the feed cooperative, the library, the county clerk's office. By the time the sun was down, there was no adult in Millhaven County who had not heard what Everett Marsh had been doing with those lumber piles. Clem Rutherford heard it from his assistant, who had heard it from his wife, who had gotten a message from someone at the feed cooperative. He was in his truck within 20 minutes, driving the county road past the north fence, slowing when the workshop came into view. Lights on inside, the silhouettes of people moving past the windows, a flatbed truck back to the loading dock being loaded by Tatum, with the focused efficiency he'd developed over 3 years of doing exactly this. Clem pulled off the road. He sat in his truck and looked at the operation he'd been driving past every Thursday for 13 years. He came by the following morning officially and stood in the doorway of the workshop the way he'd stood in doorways before, but with a different stillness to him now, a stillness that had retrospection in it. His 2 employees from the mill stood behind him, looking at the workshop with the expressions of people encountering an argument they hadn't been given a chance to respond to. Lyle was at the bench. Vera was in the finishing area. Gus was at the back, steady as always. One of the mill employees shook his head with the slow deliberateness of a man absorbing a 13-year correction. "We've been throwing away a furniture business the whole time." Clem didn't answer. He put his cap back on. He looked at Everett, who had come in from the barn to find them there. Something passed between the 2 men that didn't require language, a mutual recognition of the specific irony of their arrangement, which had begun as Clem's solution to a disposal problem, and had become, without either of them planning it, the inventory system of a nationally distributed furniture maker. "Delivery still Thursday?" Clem asked. "Thursday," Everett said. Clem nodded. He turned. He drove back to the mill. The weeks that followed had a quality Everett hadn't experienced before, the quality of being seen by people who had already formed an opinion of you and are now in the process of revising it. He went to Dottie's on Saturday morning, as he had most Saturday mornings for years. He sat at the far end of the counter. Dottie poured his coffee. The room was different in a way that was not dramatic, not celebratory, not uncomfortable. It was the difference of a room that now knew something it hadn't known before. People said hello differently, not obsequiously, just with a directness that hadn't been there when he was the junk man. Birch Calloway was at his stool. He turned when Everett sat down, turned with a deliberateness that indicated the turn had been intended, not incidental. Business good, he asked. The question had no performance in it, none of the affectionate mockery of earlier years. Genuine curiosity, the curiosity of a farmer who understands better than most what it takes to make something grow out of unpromising ground. Very good, Everett said. Birch was quiet for a moment. Then, still making tables from... He stopped himself, restarted. Still making tables from the mill. Still. Birch nodded. He looked into his coffee cup. When he looked up, his face held the specific expression of a man honoring a debt he hadn't known he owed. I'll be damned, Marsh. Everett drank his coffee. He left exact change on the counter. He drove home. He invited Tatum, Lyle, Vera, Gus, and the three newer people into the workshop on a Friday evening after the week's work was done. The barn was orderly in the way it always was, at day's end tools in their places, surfaces swept, current projects secured on their benches or in the drying racks. The evening light came through the west-facing windows at the low angle it took in May, falling across the workshop floor in long, warm stripes. Everett went to the shelf above the main workbench, his workbench, the one he'd set up when he first expanded from the shed, where Silas's composition books stood in the same order he'd found them in 12 years ago. He took them down, all 14 of them, set them on the bench in a stack. He looked at the stack for a moment. He looked at the 7 people in the room. He picked up the top notebook. He held it out toward Gus Pemberton, who stood nearest, who had spent 3 years helping Everett figure out how to transfer what was in these books into the hands of people who hadn't had 12 years to absorb it through practice. Gus took the notebook with both hands, the gesture of someone receiving something that has weight beyond its physical weight. Everett's voice was steady, matter-of-fact, the voice he used when a thing needed to be said plainly. Silas gave these to me. Now they belong to all of you. Nobody spoke. Tatum looked at the floor. Vera looked at the stack of notebooks. Lyle looked at his hands, the hands that had spent 3 years learning what the notebooks described. The 3 newer people stood very still, understanding that they were in the presence of something that preceded them. What Everett understood in that room, surrounded by people who had made their livelihoods from a resource everyone else had written off, was that the work was not a solitary achievement. It was a chain. Silas to him to these 7 people to the ones who would come after. The knowledge in those notebooks had been written by a man who understood that doing things well is not enough. You have to be willing to write down how for people you haven't met yet. Gus held the notebook. He opened it to the first page. He read the first sentence in silence. He looked up at Everett with an expression that required no translation. Everett walked to the barn door and opened it. The evening air came in carrying the smell of fresh-cut oak from the week's deliveries, the smell that had been part of every working day for more than a decade. He walked out across the property in the long evening light past the north fence, where the Thursday piles stood in their organized rows, smaller now than at their peak, but permanent in the way that a recurring thing is permanent, always replenished, always waiting, always holding in its rough surfaces what only a particular kind of attention could reveal. Delia's car came down the drive a few minutes later. She had driven up from Knoxville that afternoon, timing her arrival to the end of the workday, understanding without being told that this particular Friday needed a particular kind of witness. She walked across the yard to stand beside him. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She looked at the oak piles at the workshop lit behind them at the hills going dark above the tree line. The silence between them had the quality that silence reaches after long years of shared understanding. Not empty, not waiting for something to fill it. Complete in itself. Delia finally spoke, her voice carrying the careful attention of someone framing a question she's been holding for a long time. What did Silas actually see when he picked up the wood? Everett reached down to the nearest pile, the freshest delivery. Thursday's load still pale with recent milling bark, still attached along one edge, the shape crooked in the specific way that made it unusable to anyone operating from a list of standard dimensions. He picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, the weight of dense-grained wood, the weight of slow growth. He turned it in his hands until the angle was right. He lifted it toward the last light in the western sky. The sun caught it. The grain appeared not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the gradual way that things become visible when you finally hold them in the right light. Swirling, intricate a pattern formed over decades in response to nothing more than weather time, the specific angle of a hillside toward the sun. Not designed, discovered. The record of everything the tree had survived written in the only language it had. He saw the table hiding inside the tree, Everett said. Delia looked at the slab in his hands. She looked at the figure in the grain, visible now, clear as anything. She nodded once slowly, the nod of someone who has just heard a thing confirm that they already knew. Everett lowered the slab. He held it for a moment longer, feeling the weight of it, the specific temperature of wood that has been outdoors in May. Then he set it back on the pile, with the care he always used, not ceremoniously, just correctly, the way you treat material you intend to use well. He looked at the workshop. Inside, through the windows, he could see Gus at the bench, the notebook open in front of him, reading the way Everett had read it 12 years ago carefully, with the understanding that every detail was there for a reason, that the person who wrote it had learned each thing at some cost. The work didn't stop because the day was significant. The work continued because it was what the day was made of. He turned. He walked back toward the workshop. He had a table to finish in the morning.